Now let us move into 3 advanced areas that are often ignored by students but can make your answers stand out in competitive exams: textual history, stagecraft, and genre blending. First, textual history. Shakespeare's plays were preserved in different versions known as quartos and folios. Quartos were smaller, earlier printed editions, while the famous First Folio was the larger collected edition published after Shakespeare's death by his fellow actors. An important point is that these texts often contain variations. Certain lines, scenes, or even character details may differ from one version to another. This makes Shakespearean studies not only literary but also textual and editorial. Next, stagecraft. Shakespeare's theatre used very minimal props and scenery. Instead of elaborate sets, language itself created the setting. Through dialogue and imagery, audiences imagined forests, palaces, or magical worlds. Another fascinating detail is that female roles were originally played by young boys. This adds another layer of irony and complexity, especially in comedies involving cross-dressing and disguise. For example, a boy actor plays a woman who disguises herself as a man, creating multiple layers of performance and identity. Finally, genre blending. Shakespeare rarely kept genres completely separate. He often mixed comedy with tragedy or romance. As a result, some plays become emotionally and morally complex rather than purely comic. This blending eventually led critics to identify a category called the problem plays, where the tone remains ambiguous and difficult to classify. So, these aspects, textual variation, theatrical technique, and genre mixing, show Shakespeare's extraordinary complexity as a dramatist. Now let us look at the major types of Shakespearean comedies. Although each play is unique, critics generally classify them into different categories based on themes, setting, and dramatic structure. Now let us study one of the most important and popular forms of Shakespearean comedy, romantic comedy. In romantic comedies, love becomes the central theme of the play. The story usually focuses on lovers who face various obstacles before finally achieving union and happiness. These obstacles may include misunderstandings, disguise, family opposition, mistaken identity, or social restrictions. However, unlike tragedy, these conflicts are eventually resolved in a happy and harmonious way, usually ending in marriage or reunion. Some of the most important examples are As You Like It, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. An important exam trick to remember is that romantic comedies often use forest settings or spaces away from normal society. These locations act as places of escape, freedom, and transformation. Characters leave the restrictions of society, discover their true selves, and eventually return with greater understanding. So, in Shakespearean romantic comedy, love is not just emotion. It becomes a force that transforms individuals and restores harmony. Now let us look at another important type of Shakespearean comedy, the comedy of errors. This type of comedy is mainly built on mistaken identity, confusion, and chaos. The humor comes from characters being constantly misunderstood, especially because of identical appearances or similar situations. A common feature is the use of twins, where one character is mistaken for another, leading to comic misunderstandings, arguments, and confusion. As the confusion increases, the dramatic tension also becomes more entertaining for the audience. The best example is the Comedy of Errors, one of Shakespeare's earliest comedies. The entire plot revolves around 2 sets of twins, creating continuous misunderstanding and comic disorder. An important literary point is that Shakespeare was inspired here by the Roman playwright Plautus, especially Roman farcical comedy traditions based on mistaken identity and clever plotting. So, this type of comedy depends less on deep psychology and more on fast-paced confusion, coincidence, and comic chaos, leading finally to recognition and resolution. Now let us examine 2 advanced and highly important categories: comedy of manners and problem plays. First, comedy of manners, or what we may call its early or proto-form in Shakespeare. These plays focus on social behavior, wit, and verbal intelligence. Instead of relying mainly on physical comedy or confusion, They create humor through sharp dialogue and clever exchanges between characters. A major feature is satire on society. Shakespeare gently mocks pride, arrogance, artificial behavior, and social pretensions. Another important feature is witty verbal battles, especially between male and female characters. The best example is Much Ado About Nothing, where the conversations between Beatrice and Benedick are filled with intelligence, sarcasm, and emotional tension. Their verbal conflict becomes a major source of comedy. Now let us move to problem plays, also known as dark comedies. These plays are very important because they do not fit neatly into either comedy or tragedy. Their main feature is mixed tone. Serious moral issues exist alongside comic situations. They also contain moral ambiguity, meaning the audience cannot easily decide what is right or wrong. Important examples include Measure for Measure and All's Well That Ends Well. These plays raise uncomfortable questions about justice, sexuality, authority, and ethics. Even though they end with marriage or social order, the emotional and moral tensions remain unresolved. So, problem plays show Shakespeare moving beyond simple comedy into a more complex and realistic understanding of human life. Now let us study the stock features of Shakespearean comedy. These are recurring dramatic techniques and patterns that appear again and again in many of Shakespeare's comic plays. They are extremely important for competitive exams. The first major feature is disguise and cross-dressing. In many comedies, female characters disguise themselves as men. This gives them greater freedom, mobility, and power within society, while also creating confusion and comic tension. A famous example is Viola in Twelfth Night. Through disguise, Shakespeare also explores gender identity and social roles. The second feature is mistaken identity, which acts as the core comic engine of many plays. Characters are misunderstood, confused with others, or fail to recognize true identities. This creates chaos, humor, and dramatic irony until the final revelation restores order. Third is the very important green world concept proposed by the critic Northrop Frye. According to this idea, characters move from ordinary society into a special space, usually a forest or rural setting. In this green world, normal social rules are relaxed, transformation becomes possible, and characters discover their true selves. Finally, they return to society changed and matured. The forest symbolizes freedom, while the city or court often represents restriction and control. The fourth feature is the fool or clown character. These characters may appear humorous or foolish on the surface, but they often speak profound truths through wit and comedy. Characters like Festive and Touchstone use humor to expose human weakness and social hypocrisy. Finally, the marriage ending. Most Shakespearean comedies conclude with one or even multiple marriages. These marriages symbolize the restoration of order, social unity, and harmony after confusion and conflict. So, these stock features, disguise, mistaken identity, the green world, fools, and marriage endings, form the structural backbone of Shakespearean comedy. Now let us move into a very sophisticated aspect of Shakespearean comedy, binary structure and the journey towards self-knowledge. Shakespeare often builds his comedies using character pairs and contrasts. This binary structure creates balance, tension, and dramatic depth within the play. For example, we frequently see serious lovers contrasted with witty lovers. Some characters express love emotionally and sincerely, while others approach it through humor, sarcasm, or intellectual debate. Similarly, Shakespeare contrasts the court and the country. The court often represents restriction, politics, and artificial behavior, whereas the countryside or forest symbolizes freedom, natural emotion, and transformation. Another major contrast is reality versus illusion. Characters live under misunderstandings, disguises, or false assumptions, and much of the comedy emerges from the tension between appearance and truth. Now let us come to the most important point, the self-knowledge arc. In Shakespearean comedy, the real journey is not physical but psychological. Characters begin in illusion, they misunderstand themselves, love, or other people. But through conflict and experience, they gradually move toward recognition and self-awareness. A very good example is Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing. At the beginning, he mocks love and marriage, but eventually he recognizes his true emotions and undergoes inner transformation. This leads to an advanced exam insight. Shakespearean comedy is not just entertainment, it is a process of epistemological growth, meaning growth in knowledge and understanding. So, comedy becomes a journey from illusion to recognition, from ignorance to self-awareness. Now let us examine 3 subtle but highly important aspects of Shakespearean comedy: justice, coincidence, and humor. First, justice in comedy. Shakespearean comedy usually does not focus on strict legal justice. Instead, it emphasizes social justice and reconciliation. Characters who make mistakes or create problems are often forgiven rather than severely punished. This is one of the major differences between comedy and tragedy. In tragedy, wrongdoing often leads to punishment, suffering, or death. But in comedy, the emphasis is on reconciliation, restoration, and social harmony. The goal is not destruction, but reintegration into society. Next, the role of coincidence. Shakespeare frequently uses coincidences to move the plot forward. Characters unexpectedly meet, overhear conversations, receive mistaken messages, or discover hidden truths at exactly the right moment. From a realistic perspective, these events may seem unlikely. However, comedy does not depend entirely on realism. Instead, it works through probability and dramatic acceptance. The audience accepts coincidence because it helps create resolution and harmony. Finally, humor types. Shakespeare's comedy operates on multiple levels at the same time. He uses verbal wit, including puns, wordplay, and irony. He also employs situational comedy, where misunderstandings create humorous circumstances. Physical comedy or slapstick appears through exaggerated action, confusion, and comic movement. At a deeper level, Shakespeare includes intellectual humor, where comedy carries philosophical insight. A character like Festive in Twelfth Night is a perfect example. Although he appears to be a fool, his humor is thoughtful, philosophical, and deeply insightful about human nature. So, Shakespearean humor is not simple laughter, it ranges from physical entertainment to profound intellectual reflection. Now let us explore 3 deeper symbolic aspects of Shakespearean comedy: costume and identity, the play of desire, and the ritualistic nature of endings. First, costume and identity symbolism. In Shakespeare's comedies, clothes are not merely decorative. They function as identity markers. When a character changes clothes, it often symbolizes a change in social role, freedom, or psychological identity. This becomes especially important in cross-dressing plots. Female characters disguise themselves as men and gain new forms of authority, confidence, and mobility. Through costume, Shakespeare shows that identity is not always fixed. It can be performed, altered, and questioned. Next, the play of desire, which is a more advanced theoretical idea. In many comedies, characters do not simply fall in love with real individuals. Instead, they fall in love with ideas, fantasies, or imagined versions of people. Desire becomes unstable and shifts rapidly from one object to another. This is clearly visible in A Midsummer Night's Dream, where magical influence causes characters to change their affections suddenly and irrationally. Shakespeare suggests that love is often driven more by imagination and projection than by stable reality. Finally, let us look at comic endings. The marriages at the end of Shakespearean comedies are not just personal romantic conclusions. They are ritualistic and social in nature. Marriage symbolizes the restoration of community, harmony, and collective order. So, the ending is not only about 2 individuals coming together, it represents society healing itself after confusion and disorder. Now let us move into a very high-scoring area for competitive exams: problematic elements and critical terminology used in Shakespearean comedy. Modern critics argue that Shakespeare's comedies are not completely ideal or innocent. Beneath the humor and happy endings, many problematic elements exist. One important issue is forced marriage, where individual choice is sometimes limited by social authority. Another issue is gender inequality. Although women may appear intelligent and powerful during the play, they are often returned to traditional roles at the end. There is also the issue of religious and cultural bias. A major example is The Merchant of Venice, where the treatment of Shylock has led to debates about anti-Semitism and prejudice. These aspects make Shakespeare's comedies morally and politically complex. Now let us look at some critical terms that can significantly improve your exam answers. The first is Carnivalesque, a concept associated with Mikhail Bakhtin. It refers to temporary social freedom, role reversal, and the breakdown of hierarchy during festive moments. Next is the Green World theory by Northrop Frye, where characters move from restrictive society into a transformative natural space before returning renewed. Other important terms include comic resolution, meaning the restoration of harmony at the end, social reintegration, where characters are reunited into society, and festive structure, which emphasizes celebration, music, and communal joy. Using these critical terms correctly can make your answers sound more analytical, scholarly, and exam-oriented. Now let us conclude with 3 subtle but highly sophisticated ideas in Shakespearean comedy. First, performance irony. During Shakespeare's time, female roles on stage were played by young male actors. At the same time, many female characters within the plays disguise themselves as men. This creates a fascinating triple-layer irony. A male actor plays a female character who then pretends to be male. Shakespeare uses this complexity to blur the boundaries between appearance and reality, gender and performance, identity and illusion. Next, open versus closed endings. Most Shakespearean comedies have closed endings, meaning the conflicts are fully resolved through marriage, reunion, and restoration of order. However, some comedies remain slightly open or ambiguous. Even after the happy ending, moral or emotional tensions continue beneath the surface. This ambiguity adds depth and realism to the plays, making them more than simple entertainment. Finally, the philosophical core of Shakespearean comedy can be summarized in one idea: human beings are flawed, imperfect, and often irrational, but despite these weaknesses, life continues harmoniously. Unlike tragedy, which ends in destruction, comedy accepts imperfection and still moves toward reconciliation, renewal, and hope. Now let us examine the major themes in Shakespearean comedy. These themes are extremely important for both literary understanding and competitive exams. The first and most central theme is love. Shakespeare presents love in many different forms. We see romantic love between lovers, but also self-love, vanity, and emotional illusion. In many plays, characters fall in love not with reality, but with appearances and imagined ideals. This makes love both beautiful and irrational. The second theme is gender fluidity. Shakespeare often uses cross-dressing, where women disguise themselves as men. This allows female characters to challenge patriarchal restrictions and move more freely within society. Through disguise, Shakespeare questions fixed ideas about gender and identity. The third theme is social order versus freedom. This is often represented symbolically through setting. The court or city usually represents rigid rules, hierarchy, and social pressure. In contrast, the forest or rural world symbolizes freedom, self-discovery, and emotional honesty. Characters temporarily escape social restrictions and return transformed. Another important theme is illusion versus reality. Characters are frequently deceived by appearances, disguises, or mistaken assumptions. Shakespeare suggests that human beings often confuse illusion with truth, especially in matters of love and identity. Finally, time and transformation. As the play progresses, characters evolve psychologically. Comedy becomes a process of inner growth, where individuals gain self-awareness and emotional maturity. So, Shakespearean comedy is not merely about entertainment, it explores love, identity, freedom, illusion, and human transformation in a deeply philosophical way. Now let us study some major critical concepts that can make your answers more analytical and high-scoring. The first concept is that comic resolution does not simply mean happiness. In Shakespearean comedy, the ending is more than a joyful conclusion. It represents social correction and moral learning. Characters recognize their mistakes, relationships are repaired, and society returns to balance. So, the comic ending has ethical and social significance, not just emotional satisfaction. The second important concept is the carnival spirit, associated with the critic Mikhail Bakhtin. During carnival-like moments in comedy, normal social rules temporarily collapse. Hierarchies are reversed, authority is mocked, and people experience freedom from social norms. This temporary chaos creates a space where transformation becomes possible. However, by the end of the play, order is restored again. The third concept is festive comedy. Shakespeare's comedies are closely connected with festivals and celebrations. Music, dance, disguise, laughter, and communal joy all contribute to a festive atmosphere. But these festivals are not merely entertainment. They symbolize renewal, emotional release, and the restoration of harmony after disorder and confusion. So, these critical concepts help us understand Shakespearean comedy not simply as humorous drama, but as a social, philosophical, and cultural experience.